So, good afternoon, and welcome to the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. My name is Kenneth Bo Nielsen, and today I represent both NUPI and Asia-nettverket, the Norwegian Network for Asian Studies, and we are jointly organizing this afternoon's talk. And I'm very happy to welcome today Geir Helgesen, who is the director of NIAS, the Norwegian Institute the Nordic Institute for Asian Studies, located in Copenhagen. A while back, we came to learn that Geir was in this part of the world, and we, as quickly as we could, invited him to give a talk on his area of expertise. And we're delighted to have you with us today. He is one of the leading experts on Korean political affairs that we have in the Nordic region. And is also very knowledgeable on East Asian affairs and Northeast Asian affairs more generally. So we truly look forward to the discussion this afternoon. The topic of the talk today is North Korea and the US, a simplified black and white conflict. And we'll learn more about whether the Doomsday Clock is fast approaching midnight or whether we can lower our shoulders and relax for the foreseeable future. We have, after the talk, comments by two of our in-house experts on East Asia and North Korea, respectively, Bjørnar Sverdrup Thygeson and Sverre Lodgaard, who will offer brief comments and help us move the discussion ahead. After that, we'll open up for questions and comments from the audience, and we aim to finish no later than 4:45. Before I give the word to Geir, I will also let you all know that the event today is being streamed live. So, Geir, without further ado, thank you for coming. The floor is yours.
Very much, and I hope that your applause will also come after my speech, even though you might not totally agree with all what I'm saying. I have a manuscript. It will take me 40 minutes to go through it. And since it's in English and I have been asked to prepare this in English, I don't dare to do it without a manuscript. I'm pretty good at reading, even in English. There might be words that I pronounce a little bit Norwegian or Danish, but I'll do my best. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for your two kind words. I'm probably the most quoted I heard from the Norwegian embassy in Seoul, the most quoted so-called expert on Korean affairs in this country, because there are so few experts on this field. They didn't say the last sentence, but that's the truth. And the title of my talk is North Korea and the United States, the simplified black and white conflict. Please tell me if I'm speaking too close to the microphone or too far away from it. If you can't hear, give me a sign. It's difficult for me to know. In the introduction to this presentation, I quoted from the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, where the Science and Security Board maintains the Doomsday Clock, mentioned in the introduction, a symbolic instrument revealing how close we might be to a nuclear meltdown. In 1947, when this clock was established, it was set at 7 minutes to midnight, or doomsday. Today, 70 years later, the clock stands at 2.5 minutes to midnight. And now I quote, "Due to President Donald Trump's comments over North Korea, Russia, and nuclear weapons," unquote. Usually we hear through different media outlets that Kim Jong-un, the crazy North Korean dictator, is the one who puts world peace on stake. It is scaring, but I can't help adding also refreshing that the other part in this ongoing war on words here is mentioned as being co-responsible for the horrible situation on the Korean peninsula. What is not unusual is news about North Korea. It is a pet topic for all kinds of news media everywhere, traditional and electronic, professional media outlets, and the so-called social media, a grave misnomer in my view. All of them report more or less the same stories. The recurrent theme is that North Korea is a horror story for real, and this promotes fear due to the unbelievably inhuman actions happening in that country. A worse leadership than the one in North Korea is unthinkable in the modern world, and a worse fate of the whole population is unimaginable. As hell was the ultimate fear during the Western Christian past, North Korea and the ruling Kim clan is the ultimate fear of our modern world. This is still the case in Europe and the United States, and for years it was like this in South Korea as well, although the perception have actually been more nuanced in South Korea than in the rest of the world. Even when anti-communism come anti-North Koreanism in South Korea was functioning as the state ideology and was mixed in with moral education in the primary and secondary school curriculum and beyond, a certain skepticism toward this official ideology survived. After all, the Northerners were also Koreans, brothers and sisters. This may seem paradoxical and even difficult to believe. South Korea and its people would, after all, be the first to suffer if hell broke loose on the peninsula. My basis for claiming that a more nuanced position among South Koreans were prevalent, even during times of dictatorship, is first and foremost based on my personal impression during my 35 years of relations with Korean partners. And I would maintain that it is quite widely understood in South Korea that the picture painted of the Northern brothers and sisters very often and to no small degree was tainted by political and ideological interests. Not so in the North, unfortunately. This claim is also based on my own experiences in the North. Here, Americans, Japanese, and the ruling elite in South Korea are depicted as cold-blooded murderers, traitors, and imperialists. However, this is to be expected in a closed country with a monolithic political system. My main concern, therefore, is the Western media. There is almost no reservation with regards to bad, sad, and crazy news about something or someone in North Korea. Whether such news are presented by ultra-conservative think tanks, the intelligence institutions in South Korea, Japan, or the US, or, as often is the case, by bloggers on the social media, so-called, it is all swallowed and digested as healthy food. How can this be the case in the free world, where we do have a free press, where we have digging journalism, and where source criticism is a basic and fundamental part of the journalistic trade? Is there a free world conspiracy against the victimized and basically innocent North Korea? No. That would be a too critical judgment of our media in general and a too positive characterization of North Korea. This said, however, a too negative media coverage of the North is highly problematic. When all stories read, seen, and heard about North Korea are negative, true and false alike, a basic pattern is established and reinforced by repetition over a lengthy period of time. When this happens in open societies with a free press, the outcome is that alternative coverage are met with skepticism, suspicion, and distrust. A bleak truth is created that leaves no space for any light. Marcus Nolan, a respected North Korea observer in the US, suggested in a recent article that such news on North Korea tend to have an echo chamber effect. So when news on the North get into the public domain, they will be infinitely repeated. And what is repeated universally must be right. At least one cannot blame people for thinking this way, which is unfortunate, because the consequences is demonization. It may aim at targeting the North Korean leadership only, but it's actually hitting and hurting the entire North Korean people. This is why de-demonizing North Korea is an urgent task. By de-demonizing, I'm not arguing for whitewashing of the regime in Pyongyang. It is all about searching for a more reasonable and effective relationship, and not least, to take our own endorsement of humanism, democracy, and human rights seriously, and not use these positive positions as our weapons of mass destruction. As much as I regret the continued development of nuclear weapons and sophisticated missile technology in North Korea, which is escalating the conflict, I'm also critical towards the international response. With a continued ever tighter embargo, isolation, and threats of military retaliations. When 200,000 soldiers from countries seeing North Korea as their main enemy are conducting military drills outside the North Korean shores, it is presented as an action for peace. When North Korea is testing weapons in the East Sea of Korea, it is front-page stories worldwide and is presented as an aggressive and undermining peace act, undermining peace and stability in the region and threatening world peace. It goes without saying that North Korea is seeing the sequence the other way around. And we may disagree in that, but we should not, as is the case at present, refuse to take their understanding into account. By doing so, we are contributing in preserving not peace, but the conflicting relationship between the parties. To depict the enemy as inhuman has been the universal normal practice throughout history. Without such mental preparation, it might have been more difficult to send young men out to slaughter other young men, or to kill anyone belonging to the other side, often for reasons difficult to grasp. A demon, however, is feared, and fear is an immensely strong emotion. In a conflicting situation, with the other as dehumanized, a worthless creature and having aggressive intentions, a military solution may seem logical. Then it becomes a matter of them or us. The fact that we, the human species, have this destructive tendency is well known and commented upon. The German philosopher Immanuel Kant wrote, quote, "No nation at war with another shall permit such acts of war as shall make mutual trust impossible during some future time of peace. Some level of trust in the enemy's way of thinking must be preserved even in the midst of war, for otherwise no peace can ever be concluded, and the hostilities would become a war of extermination." Some level of trust in the enemy's way of thinking is necessary, Kant stated. But if then the enemy is North Korea, would that at all be possible? Recent experiences tells us that it is. After the latest six-party consultations on the North Korean nuclear issue in 2007, a document was released with a host of issues, but one in particular is worth mentioning in this context. It was stated in the document that all parties concerned, the 6 parties, agreed that the prevalent lack of trust between parties was a great obstacle in the negotiations, and that building of trust was a precondition in order to move forward towards a negotiated and sustainable solution. The question is if there can be trust despite double demonization. It is not likely. And then one could ask whether trust is the same from a Korean and an American point of view. It is probably wise to operate with levels. A total trust is unlikely, but some level of trust, to quote Kant, should be possible if there is some level of rationality on both sides. The former US President Carter, who held office from 1977 to 81, wrote last month an article in Washington Post under the headline, "What I Learned from North Korea's Leaders." A very brave headline, I would say, these days, where he stated that they are largely immune, they, the North Korean leaders, are largely immune from influence or pressure from outside. And then he underlines that there is no remaining chance that the North Korean leaders will agree to total denuclearization, as they have seen what happened to denuclearized Libya, and that they are observing the doubtful status of the nuclear agreement between the US and Iran. Jimmy Carter is not just any retired US president. He has closely followed the development in North Korea over a period of more than 20 years, conducted many visits in that period, and in his recent article he reveals that he has spent many hours in discussions with top North Korean officials, including the founder of the country, Kim Il-sung, and that he found the leaders to be completely rational and dedicated to the preservation of their regime. But if they are evil, what then? They, the North Koreans. A fascinating study by the American political scientist Fred Alford, published in 1999, investigates the notion of evil in Korea. His findings present 2 very important insights. The first one is that there is differences in East-West perceptions of whether the individual personal character is fixed or flexible, and thus whether it is meaningful to maintain that a person is evil. The other finding was that there is a basic difference in how we understand evil. In Alford's analysis of the Korean case, he states that, I quote, "When everything one knows about evil and everything else is learned and practiced in the family and relationships modeled on the family, how can one ever call something or someone evil?" Unquote. Therefore, in a society where all social relations are seen in terms of an extended family, even to the extent that strangers are called by terms that refer to family members, it may be close to impossible to characterize a person as evil. Is this something that even has implications for relations with North Korea? According to Alford, it has indeed. His study was carried out in the late 1990s, before the nuclear issue exploded on the Korean peninsula. He nevertheless included this as one of his hypothetical questions, phrased as follows: would it be evil if North Korea had nuclear weapons? Almost all his respondents said no, and about half of them said that North Korea would never use nuclear weapons against the South. Some elaborated by saying, if the North Koreans had nuclear weapons, they would be ours too. That was the optimists. These statements were recorded during the Kim Dae-jung Sunshine Policy period, thus the optimism, when the political agenda towards the North was characterized by engagement and reconciliation. Is there any evidence then, based on practical experiences, telling us that a more culture-sensitive approach to North Korea, acknowledging their particular ways and norms, might generate better results? By this I mean better relations, a growing level of trust, more openness from their side, adding to better and more peaceful relations on the Korean Peninsula and in Northeast Asia. The simple answer is yes. Having been around for so many years and followed ups and downs in the relation between North Korea and the outside world, I have seen that hostility has been met with hostility from the northern side, often wrapped in very strong rhetorics. Pressure from abroad has been met with serious counter-pressure, while an accommodating approach from abroad has been welcomed and positively received. The American scholar Leon Siegel has termed the relations between Pyongyang and Washington tit for tat, and it's a very good description. The problem is that it seems to be extraordinarily difficult for Washington to accept Pyongyang as an equal player. But when they do so, as when Madeleine Albright visited Kim Jong-il in 2000, it opens possibilities for real changes in the relations. The then US Secretary of State revealed positive impressions after her meetings with the North Korean leader. But Albright was an exception, and I will come back to her visit to Pyongyang. That was truly exceptional. The classic example is different, however, as it demonstrates the deep level of distrust that governs the relationship between the United States and North Korea. When the US Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the Pacific Affairs, James Kelly, came to Pyongyang in 2002, he immediately confronted the North Koreans about their clandestine nuclear program. In response, the North Korean counterpart said that they had something much stronger than nuclear weapons. The US side was convinced that Pyongyang by this meant chemical and biological weapons. It took weeks of intense analysis and assistance from South Korea to reveal the meaning of the North Korean statement, which was something like the following: united behind the direction of our leader, we constitute a fierce and undefeatable force, and as such we will reject any sort of aggression. Interpreted within the context of the North Korean political culture, the North's reply to Mr. Kelly became understandable. But this reply was only one part of it. The other part, a statement from the Foreign Ministry in Pyongyang about the US visit, further highlights the distance in communication as well as the cross-cultural miscommunication between the parties. The following is a quote from the statement from the Foreign Ministry in Pyongyang. Quote, in October 2002, Special Envoy Kelly, who visited Pyongyang, said that he had intelligence data on the highly enriched uranium program and threatened us by saying that if we did not present it, not only DPRK-US relations, but also DPRK-Japan and North-South relations will enter a catastrophic state. We were angered by the US side's extremely overt pressuring act that ignored not only our sovereignty, but even the guest's etiquette to the host in the Oriental culture. And the statement continues. Thus, our side clearly stated that we are entitled to possess even more powerful weapons than nuclear weapons to cope with the United States' growing maneuvers to isolate and crush us, and we did not even feel the need to bother to explain to the US side, the most hostile country, what these weapons are. So they knew they were kind of teasing them. The political culture approach may contribute new insight and better understanding to this complicated field of study. To pay due attention to the importance of culture, understood as a set of basic values and norms for politics, internal and international politics, it is necessary to take into account the empirically proved fact that culture changes is an extremely slow process. Further, to take the political culture into consideration implies that emotions must be included as a factor in international politics. Thus, it must be realized that hostility and hatred, as well as cooperation and friendship, impact decisions and actions by political leaders and their institutions. Allow me to share a personal experience that illustrates what I just said. During a long conversation with Kim Dae-jung in Seoul, after his presidential term had ended, he told me about his visit to Pyongyang. It was the first ever summit between the two Korean leaders, or between any two Korean leaders, and it took place, as he explained, on the other's side. We did not exactly know what to expect, he said, and continued, so we were a little nervous as we were leaving the plane to set foot on North Korean soil. Now I quote, after my memory, "Then we saw the North Korean leader on his way out to greet us," which was unexpected. "And when we met, we greeted each other, and Kim Jong-il bowed deeper than me. This was not due to our different positions or strengths, but because I was older than him. Then I knew that we had something in common, and I knew that we could talk." Unquote. After memory. Two black limousines, probably German Mercedeses, were ready to bring the two Kims to Pyongyang. However, the host invited the guest into his car, and on the way from the airport to the government guest house, the two leaders sat beside each other in the same limousine, holding hands and talking, both knowing that this could be the beginning of an era of great changes. Changes took place, but not to the extent expected. Back to my other American hero, Madeleine Albright. In her book, Madam Secretary, published in 2003, Madeleine Albright reserves a whole chapter for her visit to Pyongyang. It goes without saying that she is not in favor of the North Korean regime, but from what she tells from the meeting with Kim Jong-il, he was seriously interested in improving relations with the United States. And she believes that this would have been possible. Her own negotiations were quite fruitful, and in her book, she mentions the North Korean leader as being well-informed, open, flexible, and not afraid of admitting his own and his country's problems and weaknesses. Albright also reveals that Kim Dae-jung did whatever he could to make the US President Bill Clinton visit Pyongyang, as she was convinced that time was ripe for such a summit. Clinton's administration was ready, including the president himself, but the reason stated why such a meeting never materialized was the ongoing chaos in the Middle East. Albright also reveals, however, that several members of Congress, as well as opinion makers, were against a summit with Pyongyang, as, and now I'm quoting, as they feared that a deal with North Korea would weaken the arguments for a national missile defense system, We all know the rest of that story, although not yet the end of it. So where does all this bring us? One thing is for sure, Western approaches to North Korea must be much more aware of and sensitive to the other side's perspectives, their views and their fears. It is a relationship, and whether relations develop in a positive or negative direction depends on both or all parties concerned. The big question might be, does the West want North Korea to come out? At a certain point in time, President Clinton and his Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, made up a constructive triangle with President Kim Dae-jung in South Korea. This triangle were dedicated and with a serious urge to end the last unrelenting Cold War conflict. And they had an attentive North Korean leader to relate to. But this situation soon changed. In 2001, when Clinton's term had ended, Kim Dae-jung hurried to Washington to meet with President George W. Bush to secure continued US support for his engagement policy with North Korea. The response was very clear. Such support would not be given at any circumstance. Instead, the new Bush administration adopted what was popularly called the ABC strategy to North Korea, meaning anything but Clinton. 17 years ago, in 2000, North Korea was ready to come out. The remaining disagreements were, according to top leaders in South Korea and the United States, manageable. In Pyongyang, expectation was very high as well. This situation, the closest to a real breakthrough ever, became possible because goodwill on all sides. That's the emotional part of it. Today, the goodwill has long gone. North Korea is a de facto nuclear power. The US missile defense system is in place in South Korea, and China has expressed grave concern. In Japan, Prime Minister Abe has come closer to his vision of normalizing the military forces of his country, making the two Koreas and China alarmed. And Donald Trump is de facto president of the United States of America, while the Doomsday Clock is still ticking. What can be done? I have 4 suggestions. First, we know very little about the present North Korean leader, and that is partly our own fault. Why have the West, beside ridiculing him, totally ignored him as North Korea's de facto leader? Possibly because all were waiting for the system collapse in Pyongyang. This is unfortunate and a political and diplomatic failure based on a mix of useless intelligence reports and very much wishful thinking. Second, in Clinton's position we have Trump, not yet as isolated as Kim in Pyongyang, but even close allies are reluctant to follow the US more or less unconditionally. And based on what we know so far, Trump is not a world leader with ambitions of making the globe a better and more peaceful place to live. His America First slogan and his disregard and cancelling of international agreements signals different priorities. Third, there are new big powers around with a different and more internationally open and responsible perspective. If a triangle between Europe, China, and Korea, South Korea, was established, not to pressure the North toward regime change, but in order to offer assistance based on humanitarian ambitions and non-interference, positive developments would be conceivable. As the creation of such a triangle will be difficult, time-consuming, and possibly even too ambitious. And since this meeting takes place in Norway, what if the Nordic region took an initiative? The 5 countries could, and in my opinion should, offer to play a peacekeeping and normalizing role on the Korean Peninsula. Our long-standing diplomatic relations with both sides is one reason for suggesting this. Our traditions of acting in peacekeeping roles around the world is another. And the third one is that the Nordic region, seen from both Seoul and Pyongyang, have something different to offer compared to bigger players, which is an alternative inspiration towards a third way welfare society, where equality and social justice are held in high esteem, still, hopefully also in the future. These days, when inequality, blind consumerism and greed are threatening social cohesion in many parts of the world, a Nordic model could be a healthy source of inspiration. Fourth, and finally, after more than 60 years of conflict on the Korean Peninsula, observations and studies of this conflict, combined with new and revealing insights from the social sciences, gives us tools to deal with it in a different way. Whether there is an interest among the parties concerned to use these tools and to move away from the conflicting relations is an open question. North Korea deserves a lot of blame. It might be the #1 reason for the prolonged animosity and tensions on the peninsula. But it is not the only perpetrator. And does it help to continue banging the heads of the North Korean political elite, to isolate them and the North Korean people and push ever harder and tougher for a regime change? Reality teaches us that the answer is no. But why do we continue with this strategy then? One answer might be for our own sake. Recently, a Norwegian journalist asked me about the tightening UN embargo of the North in response to their test firing of missiles. I answered, "It is unfortunate. We are punishing millions of innocent people in North Korea. And by the way, it is also totally ineffective." Her response was, quote, "But we have to do something. We cannot allow them to threaten the whole world and just get away with it," unquote. Many people would agree with this journalist. We have to react and thus send a signal to the whole world about what we see as totally unacceptable. My take on this is that when we disregard the effect of this signal, it becomes a symbolic act only, and there are too many such acts in our reactions to and contacts with North Korea. If North Korea is not the only perpetrator in this conflict, who else is to blame? In a historical perspective, all parties concerned have committed wrongdoings. It is not for nothing that Korea was named, or rather named itself, a shrimp between whales. But to concentrate on the last 10 years, I would say that the USA and South Korea should acknowledge their part of the guilt, and they have not yet. The successful demonization of the North has made it too easy for all other parties in the conflict. Thus, a normalization process has to start with de-demonizing the North, and this process has to include soul-searching in Washington as well as in Seoul. As this cannot be expected, at least not in both capitals at the same time, there is a job to do for independent scholars with Track 2 initiatives. One is de-demonizing of the North, not whitewashing, but as a first move towards normalization that will make the slow and complicated building of trust possible. Again, the 5 Nordic countries could be helpful, as we have made the journey from foes to friends over a prolonged period of time, and we are still in the process of further developing and integrating our region into a unit where independence and cooperation are seen as mutually reinforcing each other. Unlike the European Union, the Nordic regional cooperation is grounded in a basically common culture, And it is fair to say that it's a cooperation based on common sense rather than on political ambitions. Its success is due to the fact that it's as much a bottom-up as a top-down integration. It is my hope, despite all our differences and the vast geographical distance between us, that Korea and the Nordic countries can find ways to create a common platform from which we can work towards a peaceful future for Korea and for even stronger relations between us. As we are populating the outer edges of the Eurasian continent, this would also contribute in stabilizing the whole of Eurasia in a world where conflicting relations are re-entering the international scene after a long period of peace. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Gaia. May I invite Bjørnar and Sverre to join us on stage to help us get the discussion going, please? As you like, you may stand.
Thank you so much, Kenneth, and of course, Geir, for coming over here and sharing your thoughts with us on this, of course, incredibly timely and important issue. And I know, me, as myself goes, I am really burning in with a lot of questions that I would like to ask you. I'll try and be short, though, to make sure that the public will be able to have their say as well. What I would like to sort of direct the attention to, in which I think is my role here in this panel, of course, Sverre being the North Korea expert on this issue. Personally, I've been studying China over a period of some years, and of course, what you're focusing on is what has for long been the focal point, which is the US-North Korea relationship. And of course, China is a very important third player in that. As, of course, Trump regularly reminds every one of us that China is very much an important key player in that conflict. And it is... North Korea is an incredibly complex strategic knot for China to entangle for a number of different reasons. That goes for historical and cultural attachments. It goes for the role it plays as a buffer zone for North Korea, but a buffer zone that somehow, in a sense, has started to attract more problems than what it manages to reflect from the border. And one of the ways where you can see China seeking to deal with this issue is as when you now draw up this idea of this black and white relationship between North Korea and the United States, China has been seeking to defuse the situation by seeking to create a sort of middleman role for themselves. This sort of golden mean, of course, it's a thing that's the gyllene middle, a very key part of both East Asian and Norwegian culture. And amongst the key proposals they have made is the idea of a freeze for a freeze. In other words, North Korea should freeze their development of nuclear weapons. The West, that is the United States, should freeze their regular military exercises. And I would be very interested to hear your views on that Chinese proposition.
Thank you, Geir, for an excellent and most important lecture. Some scattered comments, beginning with demonization. The US demonization of North Korea can only be compared with the demonization of Iran after the revolution. Now, the nuclear deal did much to undermine that demonization in the case of Iran, although today it is on its way back in, as is regime change. in Washington, generally regime change, and that has an address both to North Korea and to Iran. I would emphasize in this connection, speaking about the US, that US administrations have always been more or less wavering and more or less split on the question of how to deal with North Korea. Following the framework agreement of '94, the implementation of it, the US Congress was recalcitrant. The president himself at times seemed ambivalent, dragging his feet, probably many in his neighborhood, and maybe he himself was waiting for North Korea to collapse. Communist regimes did collapse in the 1990s. On the next agreement, 2007, the ink was barely dry on the US signature when another part of the US administration introduced new sanctions against North Korea. On that occasion, the chief negotiator for North Korea said, it's difficult to relate to such an administration. It is dysfunctional. And today, the president and the foreign minister of the United States are contradicting each other. The president is contradicting himself. And it is very hard indeed to see the contours of a negotiating team. It's hard to seriously believe that the US is in a real negotiating mode. Again, the administration seems to be hopelessly split. And the splits we are observing is certainly not a matter of playing good cop or bad cop. It is chaos. Confidence. Just a word about the European experience with confidence-building measures from '75, because that was a European practical innovation. The theory behind it was very simple. Transparency leads to predictability, which may build confidence. And we understood, looking back on it, that this was based on one fundamental premise. These measures could function as intended if none of the parties harbored any intention to change the political and territorial status quo by military means. South Asia doesn't have that situation. Territorial conflict in Kashmir. Confidence-building measures is a Sisyphusian effort, moving up the hill a little bit, down again. The conditions for progressive building of confidence does not exist. And a little bit of the same in Korea, because all the time, over the years, the two Korean states have entertained the idea of unifying Korea under their own leadership. So that is also an element that can explain a bit of the difficulties on the peninsula. The final thing I would like to emphasize, since you talked about missile defense too, is that the North Korean or the Korean situation provides legitimacy for missile defense in East Asia. And there is another factor that weighs in, which Christopher Hill, when he was here in the spring, talked much about then, and which has gained much attention in the months since. And this is a question of what the North Koreans really aim at, nuclear deterrence, of course. But the new proposition was a more intriguing one, that North Korea is also trying to undermine the US security assurances for South Korea. If North Korea acquires a second strike capability in relation to the United States, the United States would no longer be free to do whatever it wishes in response to a North Korean provocation. That's the argument. And you have heard that argument before. in Europe during the Cold War, especially when the Euro missiles were debated. And de Gaulle in the 60s coined it excellently. He said, the United States does not sacrifice Chicago for Paris. Only a national finger on the trigger would do. But then the point is that North Korea is not the Soviet Union. Far from it, you might say, it is at the opposite end. And the more you think about it, the more unreal this ambition becomes. It is not realistic. Maybe the North Koreans entertain such ideas. A defector is reported to have spoken about that, but I find it very hard to believe in it. And then the point is that that enemy image, that threat perception, is excellent from the point of view of legitimizing missile defense. And we see missile defense, it's been going on for 30 years, building up, but in East Asia, that is part of the build-up in relation to China. And the Chinese are very precise about it. They are not saying that this is simply directed at us, but they are saying that this is as much directed at us as it is directed at North Korea. So it's not that the conflict on the Korean peninsula simply is a big problem for the United States. It also has its upsides from the point of view of maintaining and further building the military presence in the region to rein in China. Probably spoken too much already, but I'm sitting down now.
Yeah, I think that I should limit myself because I have spoken so long already, but to the freeze for freeze. I think it's an example of a very good suggestion that is very difficult to practice if there is no trust whatsoever. And I think that trust building, some level of trust, is an absolute necessary to continue, because in 2007, the last meeting in the six-party talks, every party, all six parties, agreed that we have to develop trust. And they started and they agreed on some activities that should promote trust. But the distrust was winning out. And both parties accused the other of cheating on this treatment or this agreement. So it stopped, and there has been no work towards developing trust ever since. So I think that it's a great idea, and if we could have 1 million Chinese in the 38 parallel securing that nobody was doing stupid things for a while, it could be practiced, but that's not no.
Okay, thank you so much. We now have a full panel on stage, and I'd like to open up for questions or comments from the audience, and we can collect perhaps 2 or 3 questions before we let the panelists respond.
My name is John Jones. I have a question you have not touched. I like Helgeson's term soul searching in Washington. Could you say a little more about the relationship between the US and South Korea as well? Because I think we don't really know the role of the US in terms of being in charge of the military. I saw Pew Research from March this year, before the Trump effect had set in, that 72% of South Koreans were afraid of the US. 72% were afraid of the US in South Korea.
And to the commentators, my name is Ragne Birtelund. Trump has confused many. He is saying time and again that all options are on the table. And he said that strategic patience is no more the US policy. And what is happening is increased tension, increased uncertainties, increased danger for something going wrong. I think that, of course, any effort that could contribute to building confidence and could build the ground for government-to-government contacts and negotiations is the desirable one, and would be, in the long run, beneficial not just for the two Koreas, but for the region and for the world. I read an article recently about an Australian, I think, who was, and I want to mention this option and to have your comment, particularly Sverre, but also Geir, because the comment was really that, yes, North Korea is de facto a nuclear state, and yet one is demanding an immediate denuclearization, which is an impossible task. So the suggestion is, as one of the options, why not then recognize North Korea as a nuclear state? It may not be the same as what was during the Cold War with the USSR, that it could attack many places. It primarily would be there to secure its own survival, so to say. I'm not saying that this is a good solution, but what I want to make is, as a point, is that one really needs, in every side, in every capital or so, to think a bit out of the box. Now, how would you react if the US would put this, would move in this direction, that they would, well, they will not go for the double freeze. In fact, I have talked to North Koreans at a time when they talked about the double freeze themselves. But then if they would go for suddenly this kind of recognition, it would demand probably a lot of different approach to how then to deal with the deterrence and how to ensure also the safety of South Korea. Thank you.
My name is Soyoung Kim, and my question goes to Geir. I'm very impressed by your words about what if Nordic countries take initiatives. And you mentioned about finding common platforms. Do you have anything in your mind about common platforms?
Good. I'll let the panel respond, and we'll have another round of questions afterwards, please.
Thank you, all of you. South Korea and the US with the South Korean ambassador sitting in the room is a very tricky question to respond to. I think that South Korea is need the US bases and the US umbrella military power at the time now. But I also think that many South Koreans are a little bit nervous with the new person in the White House. And it's not the first time that South Koreans have been having double kind of a double relation to the American presence. And I think most people in South Korea, at least most people that I have met during my 35 years of coming and going, admit or see the U.S. as a guarantee of peace in the southern part of the country. At the same time, very many are irritated and can't understand that even though there are so many Korea experts in the U.S., many more than in Europe, the power holders seem to be absolutely unwilling to listen to their advice and their suggestions. So when George W. Bush talked about the outpost of tyranny and the what was it, axis of evil, at least the people that I know felt really bad that that their brothers and sisters in the north was seen as evil, and I said a little bit about what evil means to Koreans compared to what evil means to us. So it's a very, 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 very. Does it work? Thank you. Difficult. Difficult situation. I even asked the former president Kim Dae-jung, when I had the chance to discuss this with him, why do you listen to your big brother over the ocean about how to deal with North Korea, among others? And he said that that we owe them, and it's kind of a gentleman agreement. We can't go directly against our saviors in a way. Although we disagree in many ways with how they deal with this situation now, we cannot go directly against the U.S. About the situation with North Korea as a de facto nuclear power, again, I think that basically it has to do with the demonization stuff. If most people, because the gentlemen and women of the press is believing that North Koreans are totally crazy and they even have nuclear weapons and missiles, it's it's understandable that we have to deal with this in one way or another. But if we could see North Koreans as what they are, actually afraid of being the weak part in a big conflict, and they need the nuclear weapons and missiles as a deterrence against the fantastic, much more powerful United States of America just on the outside their shores. We could treat them more like normals, normal people, and like Israel has nuclear weapon, although they deny it. Pakistan and India have, and we know, and we don't treat them as bandits and outcasts. We more or less accept it. It's a fact of life, although we don't like it. And I think that it is possible to take to approach North Korea, not endorse their nuclear situation, but now this fantastic organization that have a big vision, namely to stop all nuclear, to scrap all nuclear weapons all over the world. And as far as I know, Norway is not going to sign that. Well. But I heard the lady that is leading the office, was it in Switzerland or Austria or some Switzerland? And she was asked the other day, has it any, can it have some effect on the world affairs, since no power with nuclear weapons have signed this opprop? What is it? Declaration. Thank you. And she said, it was not the smokers in Norway that actually got this røykeforbud, smoking ban. It was my boss, actually, and he never smoked and even never drank. Dagfinn Høybråten, the Secretary General of the Nordic Council of Ministers, and it's a very good comparison, I think. So we should not endorse the North Korean nuclear weapons. We should neither endorse any other country's nuclear weapons, and that's my comment to that. The common platform is actually to start with small steps, because big steps are impossible. Small steps would be that, for instance, the rich countries in the Nordic region invited North Korean students, scholars to come and to stay here and to learn some trade, at the same time see the way our systems, our societies are functioning. And it has happened already, but on a very small scale. I think that we need to accept that it takes time, we have to take small steps, and of course I really believe that if you send like this group of very, very clever, intelligent, some of us old people with authority, as a Track 2 initiative to North Korea to discuss with colleagues there about how to deal with this very dreadful situation. And I believe that North Koreans are much more afraid today because of Trump than they ever have been before, and even much more afraid than people in South Korea and Japan. So we need to address their fear and not only see them as demons, as monsters, as people that we should simply get away with.
Just two brief structural points to make here. To the question about the US-South Korea relations, it is in a sense implicit to the relationship between them. As Sverre mentioned, you had the idea from the Cold War that, well, Paris would say, can we really trust that the US would be willing to sacrifice Chicago to save Paris? And in the current, as Guy just pointed out, particularly in the current presidency, a lot of South Koreans would be nervous about, can we trust that the US will not sacrifice Seoul in order to save Chicago? Because as you see, these signals emanating out of the White House, you have, well, saying straight out, a war on the South Korean peninsula would be terrible, terrible, but we're keeping all options open. Naturally, that would tend to make you nervous if you were in Seoul. And I think, that also, as you pointed out here, I think the temporal issue here is, in a sense, important because, as Sverre actually has today to do some advertising, a very good op-ed in Dagsavisen talking about how the North Koreans, in a sense, are sprinting towards the United States pain threshold. Just out now, I saw in the newspapers, people are saying that South Korean officials saying maybe North Koreans will have relatively well-functioning missiles next year, maybe 2 years after, but it is a short time span. And as you very rightly pointed out, Guy, trust building is incredibly important, but as you said, it is a time-consuming measure. So we sort of have this situation where the clock is ticking, and the best approach is an approach that takes a lot of time. And it is an incredibly difficult structural situation to be in, and I do not have a good answer to this, but maybe you have some comments.
Reviewing the last 25 years of the relationship between the United States and North Korea. It is customary to say, especially in the US, and the president is a good example, that we have tried negotiations, it didn't function. And Trump is saying to Tillerson, you are wasting your time. But look at what actually happened in this period. In periods of negotiations and agreements, the North Koreans have slowed down, and on one occasion between 2007 and 2009, they even started disabling the plutonium facilities. 11 out of 12 steps were implemented when it broke down. And in periods without negotiations and agreements, the North Koreans seem to have used their time very well to build weapons. None of the negotiation efforts succeeded, but it was not a waste of time. It was not in vain. I'm saying that by way of background to the question about the United States and South Korea, because experiences in this period shows that it's very important to have progress on the diplomatic track that the United States and South Korea sees eye to eye. You mentioned briefly Lee Seagal. Lee Seagal of the United States has written excellently and thoroughly about that. What if the United States were to recognize, and the world were to recognize North Korea as a nuclear weapon state? Well, they are not quite there yet, not an established nuclear weapon state, and Kippe might, tell you a lot about that. We have yet to see a functioning heat shield for the re-entry vehicles. And maybe what is going on now is the important shift from liquid to solid fuel to make the missiles more mobile, to make it easier to hide them, make it easier to launch them on short notice. But if at some stage it becomes an established nuclear weapon state of some sort, if the world were to recognize that achievement, it would do huge damage to the NPT, to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We haven't recognized India either, not yet. I believe that in due course that will happen. But 20 years have passed since they tested. It has still not happened, and for some good reasons. There is a lull in the testing for the time being. Almost 2.5 months have passed without any testing of missiles. The North Koreans are saying that we are now in the final stages of this program, but we are not quite there. But they imply that we have the end in sight. They are saying that our objective is not to become a big nuclear weapon state. The closer they come then to getting a second strike capability against the United States, the more the pressure will certainly build up. There is a threshold of pain where North Korea might demonstrate a capability to hit the United States with nuclear weapons. And what can shortcut this or bring this issue on a different track is precisely negotiations, and you have been talking about a freeze. I doubt that the recent lull in North Korea is an invitation for a freeze. More likely, this has to do with issues internal to the program itself. A year ago, in connection with the change of guards in Washington, there was a similar lull for 2 months. And then the North Koreans indicated, both before the inauguration of Trump and afterwards, that they would be interested in a dialogue. Maybe they have lost faith in Trump. They haven't given any such indication that we know this time. But I would say it is very important that it comes to negotiate talks sometime soon to clarify the policies of the two sides, and to clarify what is negotiable and what is not negotiable as a prelude to real negotiations. I think the freeze proposition, forwarded by the Chinese, first of all, is a somewhat more demanding proposition. Speaking about the first possible steps, more demanding than talks about talks.
Can I just add something regarding what is on the table to be negotiated? If you read Madeleine Albright's chapter on her visit to North Korea, she simply started the talk with Kim Jong-il and asking, is there something that is kind of outside our reach of discussing difficulties between us? And Kim, according to Madeleine, said, No, I don't think so. What should that be? And she said, well, it could be your nuclear programs. And he responded, but no, 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 we can talk about that. We only have it because we are afraid of you. And, you know, again, goodwill. Maybe he was just a smart guy that kind of rhetorically made her feel happy. But I really believe that that to portray North Korea as totally crazy and unpredictable, aggressive, and so on and so forth, and just waiting for them to use the dreadful weapons that they have produced is a very, very pessimistic approach to world peace. And why don't anyone, Brenda here, he was traveling a lot. Why didn't he just stop over in Pyongyang to say hello to this guy instead of just waiting for what we hoped, what they hoped, what U.S., maybe South Korea, and very much so Japan hoped that this will just collapse. So why waste time of talking to this crazy haircut, fat, young brat, you know? But that's not a way to deal with world politics. You know, there must be talks, there must be contacts. We must look at this guy and see, is he crazy or is he almost normal?
Okay, we have around 10 minutes left, and I'll take a few more questions from the audience. Yes, please.
Hello. I'm Korean ambassador Yoon Bak. I really wanted not to say anything, but because it's mentioned that I'm here, and it's a little awkward to not talk about something. But it's really tricky for me to talk about this issue as ambassador. So please hear it as I'm saying it from my personal perspective. So don't don't regard it as an official response by my government. First, about the demonization of North Korea. Actually, it's a little complicated because from the U.S. perspective, maybe they regard North Korea simply as between a friend or enemy. So they regard North Korea, who is in conflict with their interests, as enemies. But for us Koreans, it's a little different. We had a time when we had an authoritarian government, which was under the grip of Cold War, and at that time, our security is very in danger. So at that time, the government usually portrayed North Korea as an enemy, and which maybe you can say as an evil. But when we had, since then, we had our democratization and progressive government, and then the perception it's changing rapidly that North Korea, we have to separate North Korea by two, and one is the regime who is doing evil things to North Korean people, and the other is the North Korean people. We regard it as we already know that they are our brothers, families, our fathers, and all more than million families are separated during the Korean War. And since then, the popular perception is always they are friends, they are our brothers and our fathers and sisters, which must be reintegrated. That means not reintegrated, reunited as before, back to 45 years ago. Such things is the perception mostly commonly felt, and when we survey the people, our Korean people, there are two trends coming in. That One is the young generation. Why we are living very happily without North Korea? Why we are reunite? Another is always, I think it's more than that those younger generation that they are our brothers, our nation, so we must be reunited. That's always the perception behind that. But whenever we have the governments in progress and in conservative, the approach is different. But basically, we want our aspirations is to reunite the Korea, both Koreas in a peaceful manner. That's what I would like to say about the demonization. So it's not the South Korea who are demonizing North Korea. And the second, I heard very interestingly about the history of these six-party talks. Actually, you rightly mentioned about the history of six-party talks, which started when we had the first nuclear crisis in 1994. And at that time, it was a great crisis, but actually it's a blessing in disguise because we had, since then, a very fruitful, peaceful approach and talks. Can I have water? Of course, we had many failures and many successes during the six-party talks. But as Mr. Geyer mentioned, that unfortunately the events doesn't favorably to North Korea, and almost we had seen some kind of success in sight. And then Bush administration came, and they came with a total different approach, and then it collapsed totally. But the failure actually, it's not just Bush administration. The problem is North Korea, because at that time, it's not the harsh policies of U.S., but they did very preposterous propagation to South Korea. They killed one tourist, South Korean tourist, who are traveling the mountain Kumgang, and that was really a provocation to peaceful civilians. And then we requested an apology to North Korea, and they never did that. That is one. Another one is while the sixth party is still going on, they bombarded our cities, and then also they sent armed submarines to our shores, and also they didn't made an apology. So maybe that's an unintended incident. Probably we don't know the real intent of North Korea, but what they are doing is they are, regardless of what is going on between South and North Korea, they are doing whatever they want, and then still, if I assess the general terms, until 2000, it's a good development for peace. But that was with both grandfather and the father. And then this young son came, and we had high hopes when he came to power, because he is educated in Switzerland, and he has many promises of openness and reform. But unfortunately, his power for the past 5-6 years, it's totally a disaster for North Korea. And the problem is we don't know what he is planning to, because even though we offer, the United States offer a peace proposal to him, he totally disregards it, just firing long-range missiles, testing nuclear weapons. That's the problem. So I don't say more about that. So that's the fact. But still, we have a new president who is progressive, and he has very high hopes to have a dialogue with North Korea again. So we will see what he will read too. And about the comment about why we not allow North Korea to have a nuclear weapons. They already have nuclear weapons. Why we doesn't ascertain that they have those weapons? But as already mentioned, that it's not just between South and North Korea. It's about the total nuclear international regime that is being threatened about this. So we mustn't. I just want to stop here. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We've reached the end of today's program, but I'd like to offer the last word to the members of the panel, if anyone feels the need to make a closing comment.
So, a brief comment on the two leaders then. Kim Jong-un, I would say rational. I base that on the way North Korea behaves in its foreign affairs, because that can be observed. There is much more to say about it, but he seems to be rational, and very many others weigh in on that. He is brutal, needs no elaboration, and he is more willing to take risks than his father. In the United States, the leader is unpredictable by design, by intent. You remember before the reoccupation of Mosul, he was saying it's plain stupid to tell the adversary what we are going to do in advance. So unpredictable by design, but probably also impulsive and unpredictable by nature. And that combination is probably among the worst possible we might have. Sorry to end on such a note.
Very briefly, and I think, because I think Mr. Ambassador, you raised a valid point when you're discussing essentially the difference between de-demonization and whitewashing, and how to strike that balance without becoming, of course, apologists for the North Korean regime. In that case, I'm reminded of this classic study by Ronald Krebs on the US depiction of Germany and Japan during the Second World War, where, of course, in no way the Nazis were less bad than the Japanese, but still, when the US president was talking about Germany, he was distinguishing between the regime and the Germans, whereas when I was talking about the Japanese, the entirety of the regime and the people and everyone were demonized, which of course made it then possible to send American Japanese into camps in the desert and all this, for mostly not small degree of racism behind that. And I think again that sort of keeping in mind the not to treat North Korea as a monolith in this extent is very important.
Final. I do not disagree with the ambassador to the Republic of Korea, and I really see North Korea as probably the big problem in the region, but I believe that there are other ways of dealing with that problem compared to what we have done or what the West, including South Korea, have done up till now. I think that some kind of going back, I like sunshine, and going back to sunshine 2.0 or something. We have learned a lot from Kim Dae-jung's period and his predecessors. We can work on that, but the dialogue and engagement is the only way. And I think that if South Korea, through the ambassadors in the region here, asked the Nordic countries to play a role, the foreign ministries would be more listening positively than if a scholar or a person, a Norwegian in Denmark, suggested. Yeah, And then I will also end a little bit in a negative mood. I think it's 20 seconds to do that. I happened to be present at a meeting in Seoul in South Korea, where Madeleine Albright was the host, and Madame Fu Ying of China, a spokesperson of the Chinese People's Congress, was there. And it was a very interesting meeting. Then Madame Fu said, we, the Chinese, have a problem in understanding if the US really see North Korea as a world threat, as a threat against world peace. We tend to believe that you kind of use this as an excuse of building up your military forces in this region, which is kind of scaring from our point of view. We are a big power. We are not a superpower. We will never be a superpower. We will not challenge you militarily. But we think that you should respect that Asians can actually better solve the problems between them than listening to you all the time. And I think that, well, I have kind of sexed up a little, sorry for my language, her saying, but to make it short. And the American didn't really know how to deal with it. They just said, no. North Korea is a threat. We need to be here because of North Korea. It's always North Korea, no other countries. And she was just smiling and say, well, I have to excuse us, but we have a very hard time in believing you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sverre, Bjørnar, and not least Geir Helgesen for a truly fascinating discussion today. Thank you.